Let me tell you a bit about my little brother Steve. He's 3 years younger than me, much skinnier and scrawnier than I am, and actually normally a pretty laid back character. But if he loses his temper, he properly loses it. And there's a bit of a telltale sign. First of all, his face drains of all its colour. It goes completely white. And then the colour slowly fills back up. It sloshes back in like a wine glass filling full of red wine. If you see that happen, you know to steer clear of my brother Steve. So, about 30 years ago now, when I was 13 and my little brother Steve was 10, we'd just moved house into what had been an old, slightly broken down farmhouse, surrounded by an acre of land that had gone to rack and ruin. When we moved in, the grass was knee high, maybe waist high when we were 10 or 13, and we loved it. It was a great place to be. My mum loved all the space and all the chance to do a project with the house. My dad loved all the space and all the land. And my brother and I just loved being able to run around in old broken down sheds and in this high long grass in what was turning out to be a really spectacularly hot summer. There was only one problem with our new place, and that was that one end of the garden that had previously been an orchard was swarming in wasps. All the apples had been knocked down off the apple trees, and the wasps were basically having a feast. You couldn't go near that side of the garden for fear of being stung or attacked. And it was the only sort of dark cloud on our horizon. So what happened? Well, my mum decided to give us a challenge to clear the apples from the orchard. Of course, she didn't want us to get stung, or at least we don't think she did. But she did want to get rid of the wasps and have that part of the garden opened out. So Steve and I came up with this brilliant plan. With a sharpened stick, slowly inserted into the semi-rotten apples, with practice, you could fling them from one end of the garden to the other. And eventually this became a game all of its own. Steve at one end of the garden, me at the other end of the garden, standing in front of these thick, overgrown privet hedges. Eventually we got so good at it that we'd invite our friends over, and it became a team game. Steve with the twins, Mark and Andrew, at one end of the garden, me and my best friend Ben Howes at the other end of the garden. For what seemed like hours, we would be slipping these apples onto sticks, taking aim and flinging them across the garden at each other. While on the other side, you had plenty of space to see this apple coming, duck out the way and feel it scorch into the hedge behind you. All was going well until that moment. That moment that my eyes lit up as I spied what was more like a pumpkin than an apple. A giant abnormality, a mutant apple, brown, semi-rotten, filled with those wasp holes where they've chewed away at the flesh of the apple. My eyes lit up as I slowly and carefully slid my sharpened stick into the flesh. Gently I lowered it over my shoulder, being careful not to let it slip off, and took aim at my brother, really just a silhouette, just a shape on the at the far end of the garden. I gently brought the stick forward in an arc, and it was one of those moments where everything feels right. The line felt perfect, the strength felt just right, and I could see the apple arcing in a beautiful parabola, a beautiful curve towards my brother. But it was bittersweet because I knew that all my efforts would be wasted. Steve would just see this apple flying towards him, and he'd duck, and the apple would shoot into the hedge, just like the hundreds had done before that. Except something was different. My brother was distracted. He wasn't looking at where these apples were flying from. Something else had caught his eye. Was it a blackbird on the roof or a squirrel in one of the nearby trees? Quite possibly. He had no idea of this looming, intergalactic, pumpkin-like apple which was darkening the sky over his head and veering closer and closer towards his sharp, pointy, blonde, thatched head. And then it happened. I still remember to this day the moment that that giant apple wrapped itself around my brother's forehead. I still remember the sight of a few dazed wasps trying to fly away in a state of concussion. I still remember the dark brown syrupy apple juice trickling down my brother's cheeks. And yes, I still remember the sight of his face slowly draining of every last drop of blood, and then just as slowly but just as surely filling up like a red wine glass. I knew I was in trouble. I backed away, trying to take shelter in the overgrown privet behind me. My brother, with his fists clenched, his teeth gritted, stomped towards me until he was only a matter of feet away from me. But he was 10, I was 13. He was scrawny, I was a bit bigger than him, and he knew he couldn't do me any harm. He looked around, desperate for something to pick up, desperate for something to make an impact. Unluckily for me, what came to hand was the rusty head of an old pickaxe, left over from the time when our house had been a farm. Without thinking, he picked it up, and again, without thinking, he hurled it in my direction. After hours of practice, I was convinced I'd just duck, ninja-like, out the way, and the pickaxe head would shoot into the hedge behind me, just like so many apples before it. But as I ducked, I realised that this was different. This was heavier, and this, just as quickly as I ducked my head, was falling towards me. The last thing I remember, before my world went black, was this warm feeling as sharp, rusty metal sliced through my eyebrow, just above my right eye. And as I clapped my hand to the warm sensation and took it away, I remember feeling surprised at how bright and how vivid the blood was that covered my hand. After that, everything went black.